Hi, welcome to another exciting episode of Observability for What's Next. I'm your host, Paige Cruz, Senior Developer Advocate over at Chronosphere, joined today by the king of Kafka, the maestro of events, Dan Selans. He also has co-founded a little company called Streamdal. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Thank you very much. We have worked previously together several times, actually, at New Relic and at Envision.
Today, we're going to get into one of my favorite telemetry types, which is events. But before we dive into the world of events and streaming, I like to peel it back and find out what is your definition of observability? Loaded question.
As a loaded question, it totally is, because it has, like, depending on their experience, it might be slightly different, right?
Mhm.
So I think at the most basic level, like, we're talking about having systems in place that grant you the ability to gain insights into various parts of your system, right? But then you can go much deeper into it. So you have infra level of observability.
Okay.
That's like metrics and like
Mhm.
CPU,
CPU.
and memory usage, IO, blah, 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 all that stuff. How your K nodes are doing, right?
Mhm.
And then you have APM, or application level monitoring. And that would be like the New Relics and so on, where you're able to basically enable profiling, that sort of stuff, just be able to have a more in-depth view into how long basically a method is taking to execute, right? That sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that there's another part to it as well, right? Which is streaming data performance monitoring, which is, I think it's a relatively new thing in general of having asynchronous systems and having the ability to basically trace that stuff as well and be able to gain insights into how is it performing at a grander scale, not just limited to my one or two applications that are talking over JSON. Then from the other perspective, you can look at it as there's metrics, there's logs, there's traces, and all that stuff. All of it is observability. I was driving today and I had a profound thought.
You're hearing it first from the mind of
It's
Dan
actually not that
Selans.
profound. I just realized well, this is a pretty decent way to sum it up, to the point that I was driving and I just wrote it down. And it's pretty freaking obvious that observability, let me just even read it out, like what I wrote in the car, that observability enables you to be proactive rather than reactive. And I was like, wow, amazing. And that's totally what it is, right? The more observability you have, the more ability to be able to be proactive about this stuff, right? And just know about what's going on.
So if I could sum it up, what you've told us is that observability is a tool that you can buy on the open market. Do I have that right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you go to your local Trader Joe's and then you just
One
request,
box.
please, one box of observability. Yeah, no,
Love it.
observability is that's why it's such a loaded term, really, because it's there's so much to it and there's different levels of it, right? And not everybody needs crazy levels of observability either, right?
Yeah.
Oh, speaking of which, pager duty. Oh, speaking of observability.
Okay, we can pause.
Thankfully, somebody else is going to take care of that. Yeah.
Did you need to?
No, it's totally cool.
Okay.
No, it's
oh,
all
is
good.
that an unactionable alert, Dan? Are we not having good alert hygiene? It gets us all.
You're going to call me on that. Actually, I respect you so much that I am just going to let it go to my level 2s that totally understand all this. We do have pretty good alert etiquette, and we do not allow alert fatigue to occur.
Good.
But what I was going to say is that not everybody needs super in-depth observability either, right? I don't know, a sushi delivery place that just simply processes orders and so on probably doesn't need massive amounts of distributed tracing or something like that. Yeah. It's probably okay to just be yeah, is my website up? Good enough. Yeah. That's about it. And then somebody else who's got 50 plus services or whatever, it can go, of course you're going to need logs. That's probably level 1. Then you're going to care about system level metrics and so on. That's level 2. And then you might go deeper and deeper and deeper. It totally depends on how important is this stuff really for you. How important is your engineering, right? And that sort of a thing.
I love that. Yeah. Oh, there's so many things that we could go talk about, but the theme for today is events. I think the average person has a pretty good understanding of metrics. We drive cars, we see a gauge for how fast we're going with the speed. We know about a check engine light and that a mechanic should tell us what this weird status code means. We're kind of familiar with the ways in which systems can give us signals and how helpful they are or aren't. When it comes to events, I think when I look at the evolution of telemetry, like you said, logs are kind of where people start. You print off some stuff and you're like, I am here, right? And then you kind of evolve and you're like, what if we structured this to say, I am here at this line and I'm this service in this region, right? And then we get sort of metrics. And you mentioned some of the newer players of traces and tracing. I think a span and an event are both, they're almost synonymous. It's really a semantical difference of, do you have a parent ID and timestamps? When did events come into your life as an operator, and how did you know this was like, oh, I got to pay attention to this? The logs and the metrics aren't giving me they're not giving me the level of observability I need as the king of Kafka. That's going to stick.
The king of Kafka, that's pretty sweet. I don't know if I want to be the king of that. Like, could be someone else. But anyway, yeah. So I think that's like that where the fundamental like thing is that I don't view an event as a thing, as the span or whatever. I view an event, and when I'm talking about like even monitoring or observing events, events are essentially like tallies. They're not like logs. They're basically actionable messages that a part of your system is going to send, that another part of the system is going to interpret and do something with it, right? Like, I think what we're talking about is like actionable versus non-actionable,
Yeah.
right? Like,
yeah.
meaning that like you can, off of an event, like a system level event, you can build business logic off of that sort of stuff, right? You can say like, oh, this event contains, order number, blah, 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 by this customer ID, blah, 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 and so on and so on. And like, and what happened, right?
Yeah.
And when that sort of stuff happens, like the thing that I noticed at various companies that I was at is that everybody does it on their own. Like everybody kind of rolls their own thing, right?
Yeah.
So of course they'll have like some sort of APM or some sort of distributed tracing approach for like, their HTTP services and so on. But there is another level, which is somebody is going to consume a message off of a bus, let's say like RabbitMQ or off of like Kafka or something like that.
Yeah.
That message will be decoded, and there's going to be some sort of business logic that will occur, and maybe that message or a new message is going to be emitted and put somewhere. That part right there, observability for that sort of a thing, well, it doesn't quite exist, or there's really no standard around that sort of a thing. And that's really where I kind of was like, let's do this. Let's try this out. Let's see what happens. So I started a company for it. So
yeah, okay, because I have really realized how much of my perspective on observability and my philosophies come from being a backend engineer turned SRE, and I'm like, yeah, we're tracing, we're done, this is great, we've did it. And you're like, no, we've still got black boxes we've got to deal with in these systems. So when you're talking about these async and sort of these event buses, when are these useful and necessary? When should people consider a re-architecture for that? And when is it overkill? Because we've talked about we've hinted that there could be too much observability.
Oh, absolutely. Totally. So yeah, I think that there's definitely a place, like time and place for this sort of a thing. Certainly a small place does not really need to care about this sort of a thing. When we're talking about like, this level of observability, like we're essentially let's call it like distributed async, like tracing, right? Like it's because what we
are not making new terms up on this channel, Dan.
Yeah, totally not. Like King of Kafka now talks about distributed async tracing. Yeah, what we're talking about is ultimately the ability to be able to see that like, oh, service A emitted something somewhere, and then that message showed up totally somewhere else eventually.
Okay.
We don't know, like there's no RPC, there's no typical, like service A talks to service B. No, service A doesn't even know about service B, right? It's just emitting a message into the ether and just goes like, cool, I did my thing. So
I let the pigeon go, the pigeon with the scroll. Hope it got there.
And the only, like, I imagine that like the time when people would go towards like, or start caring about this sort of a thing it's really based on size. I think that's the underlying thing. Is
size
like
of
the
system,
size,
requests.
like the size of the system, right? Okay. Like, so this, all of the above, right? Like the number of requests that you're dealing with and so on. Like if you've thought about at one point in time, if maybe you're having a beer and talking about data correctness and quality and eventual consistency, maybe you start caring about that sort of stuff as well. But like the general gist is, if you're doing something really big and it matters a lot, right? All of us, or like for instance, another example would be, I won't name which companies, but I've done circuit breakers at various companies, and I'm sure you probably have as well, right?
I've run into them a couple times.
And the whole deal with circuit breakers is that, like, well, it's very easy to shoot yourself in the foot and cause all kinds of weird failures and so on.
Self-DOSing is the best.
And that's when you start like looking at like, well, what other options are out there? So more than likely at that point, you're going to say, well, I'm probably going to do some more async stuff. So like, we're essentially talking about like background jobs, right? It's just like,
Yeah.
it's background jobs with guardrails,
Okay.
right? Like what,
Yeah.
because there's
Yeah.
like rules around this sort of a thing, or like you're trying to put rules for this sort of a thing. So that's when observability for those sort of things starts mattering.
Mhm.
But with that said, no, there's a, well, 5 years ago, I would say that there's a very small amount of companies that care about this sort of a thing because it's
Yeah.
a pretty significant investment in time and energy. But
Yeah.
I'd say I think we talked about this like at one point in time as well, is that we've been okay with accepting more complexity in exchange for, you know, some sort of a pro. Like, so we're basically saying like, yeah, I'm okay with complexity if it gives me more reliability, right?
Yeah.
And that's the
Yeah.
case of like, that's been constantly happening, right? Like we went from deploying onto hardware and then we said like, well, let's just do this virtualization thingy. And we started
VMs.
deploying on VMs or whatever. And then
Yeah.
they're like, well, you know what? This kind of sucks. So let's just add another layer into that. Let's add, you know, containerization to that.
Ooh,
And
yep.
then we're like, well, you know what? That's not enough. Let's come up with this other system. Well, let's call it orchestration. Let's do Mesos. You know what? Not complex enough. Let's do something more. Let's do Kubernetes. So now we
Yeah.
have. So point is like it's been constantly evolving,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
we're eventually like at first it might seem completely crazy, right? And I think
To
that's the
any
whole
new
thing with.
person entering who did not grow up in the days of racking and stacking, who did not like have to lovingly have server, Jim Joe Bob in the corner and oh my god, we need to kick him again because he's crapped the bed. Like for me and for that generation, we're on top of so many abstractions. I
Yes.
see why we have alert fatigue, and I see why it's hard for folks to understand signal to noise because like unless you work at a monitoring company, you really don't get exposure to treating monitoring as an art
That's
and as a
totally it. Yeah.
part of the software defined life cycle, not something you do
Yeah.
at the end, but it's literally as you're deploying code. Should I update an alert threshold? Did I make an optimization that would, turn this alert that I really trust into something that I would uh, let my secondary handle?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah. Whoever
No,
it was, and whoever's watching this, I'm sorry. I just totally did that
we're gonna
on
send you some
camera.
flowers on Chrono. It's all good.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we're opening a can of worms here, but it's totally, that's the thing. There are so many freaking abstractions to all this stuff.
Yeah.
But that's the thing is that ultimately, and I think this is like just general advice for anybody even coming into the industry in the first place, is that there's probably a good reason for it, like why it all happened and why there are so many crazy abstractions, right? Like the
Yeah.
fact that I much rather just have cattle, and like just pods getting restarted automatic. I don't care that they're getting restarted and or why even. I just bring this freaking thing up, back up again.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and the alternative to that would be me calling you at 2 a.m. and being like, Paige, get your Sunday best on. You need to go to the data center, please, and kick this box. That totally
Yeah.
sucks. And that's
Yeah.
why we have Kate's today, and we don't have to worry about that sort of stuff. So the same
Mhm.
sort of thing, I think it applies, right? Like we go into a slightly different direction when we say for observability. So
Mhm.
yes, event driven or event sourcing, all these like various different architectures that are like async based,
Yeah.
they're complex, but they
Yes.
are, as time goes on, we are becoming more and more okay with this additional complexity, right? And
Mhm.
it's eventually it's going to become totally normal that we
Yeah.
say like, well, of course you wouldn't do like completely synchronous systems. That doesn't make any sense. Like we're going to do everything async. But the
Yeah.
reality of it is that yeah, it's kind of painful. Like it's
Yeah.
there's a lot of work involved.
Totally. And so for those folks in the status quo today who are kind of caught in the middle, who are working in these event-driven systems, who do not have your lovely tool that you've built, how does the operator in a system like that, and how does operating a system with low observability that are these black boxes of okay, service A put it on the bus, we don't know what happened, and way too long, service B picked it up. How does that affect operating, like literally being on call for a system? That sounds stressful.
No, it's totally awful. And that's the reason like I started this because I was totally operating the systems before. It's almost always homegrown tools right? That like you
Huh.
just throw away scripts and so on, that you say like, cool, let me write this little quick thing that is going to be a consumer. And do we get that message? Yeah, okay. But how do I
Oh my
decode
God.
this? And then you're like, oh, there's this weird protobuf version that we're using. Okay, let's use that to decode. Oh, I can't decode it. And then and it keeps going and going and going.
That sounds
Um,
laborious.
it totally sucks. So, but like assuming, okay, let's just assume the most basic case that like the messages that these events that you're passing around, that like, let's say they're not encoded. Let's just say that they're just JSON.
Sure. Yeah. Love
Like
a
what would
JSON.
happen is like you would basically, and especially you more than likely have some sort of observability already in place, right? Like if you're already going down the path of fairly complex architectures, let's assume you probably have like basic metrics observability and basic tracing as well in place, right?
I hope
And at that
tracing's
point,
still pretty nascent. Like, as much as we're talking about events and like future big brain, tracing is still, we're not there yet with mainstream adoption.
yeah, and that is it's so weird. It's super
Tragedy.
weird to me because it's kind of like I cannot imagine writing an application, or like I wouldn't, like I don't remember thinking about how to write demonization code. Like I
Yeah.
don't write daemons anymore. I
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
write a service that runs in the foreground and I don't care. Like just
Mm-hmm.
let it go.
Yeah.
So this totally has to do with the fact that both me and you come from like a monitoring background, and like
Yeah.
because of that, like we're like, just like an observability background as well. And it's totally normal. Like, of course, you would have this sort of a thing. Like,
Yeah.
I cannot even imagine writing right now without APM. Like,
Oh my
I don't
gosh.
even compute. Like,
I legit
how
would scan job descriptions as when I was still doing SRE. And then if I saw, there's a couple words, and if I saw that, I was like, no, not enough money in the world to pay me to clean up that mess.
I don't get it. Yeah, like that's the thing. Like profiling software and so on. Like yes, I understand what it takes to profile software, but I don't want to. Okay,
Yeah.
like I just want to click a button and go to the freaking profile. That's
Mhm.
it. Like,
Yep. Oh yeah.
so the concept of not having APM, that's just like crazy to me. So
Mhm.
distributed tracing, I suppose, kind of, but at the same time, anybody that is serious about like operating distributed systems, it is weird to me that like that you wouldn't have distributed tracing. Of course you should have. If you are proud of this thing, and that you are a good maintainer of your
Mhm.
distributed system, and you have 10 plus services that talk to each other, you should have something, because otherwise you're totally flying blind. It is super
Yeah.
weird.
Or you're relying on the humans to stitch together the story of a request, when instead you could get the whole story, table of contents right
Yeah,
at your fingertips.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I know that we totally veered off of something here, but
Yeah,
like
and no,
I'll try to
events.
take it
So
back.
similarly to, so people operating event-driven structured systems today are in this situation in the
Piecing
dark.
all this stuff together. Yes.
Yeah.
Like so that's why we were talking about distributed tracing, is because that infrastructure and all those systems that you have in place for distributed tracing, you can totally use it for this as well, right? Like
Hmm.
there's nothing preventing you. All that we're talking about ultimately is that like all those instrumentations for OTel or whatever else,
Just
all
OTel.
that
We are
stuff.
OTel fans on this podcast.
Okay, so like I just dropped some motel stuff and I get brownie points. So yeah, so like if you've already instrumented your code for this stuff, all that it ultimately means is that like the things that would be handled for you automatically, like previously, right? Like let's say it's two services talking to each other. Well, they're
Mhm.
probably going to talk over HTTP, and you probably instrumented your handlers to automatically pass on traces via headers.
Yep.
Cool. If you're in an async world, that's not going to happen automatically, because more than likely you're using something kind of weird. Like in the case of, let's say, like you probably shouldn't do this, but let's say you're using Redis or something like that as your bus. Well,
Lovely.
there are no headers, all right? There are no attributes, there's nothing. So you have to figure out like, well, how am I going to pass this trace information on? And that's the whole thing, right? That's the whole
Yep.
spiel. That's what folks would have to do. Like I've seen cases where like people, so first off, the example with Redis is totally a thing. Like because I've totally
No, I
witnessed
know
that.
it hurts because it's true.
Yeah. Or like same with, what was another one? There was like yeah, that was the best one. I was like, it was gzip JSON that was passed on Redis. And so you
Mhm.
had to decompress the JSON, and then it had some sort of like header or properties that you could like, inject into it and whatnot. So it was
Sure.
pretty
Those words
gnarly.
all should go together. Whew.
Yeah, yeah. You have to inject stuff into JSON. Great. But that's the thing, right? So like in the case of if we use some other system, let's say like Kafka, which does have headers, or RabbitMQ, which has attributes. So it's just essentially like headers.
Yeah.
That's what you would do, is that if you wanted to truly get into this observability part, right, or instrument this area, you would say, okay, I want to inject these traces into these attributes, and then the consumer is going to read that message that off of the bus and know that like, oh, I need to look at these. I need to like to actually stitch this whole thing together. I need to take a look at these particular attributes or whatever. Point is, you do it by hand, and it totally sucks.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And so a good follow on for this is similarly to when you first turn on tracing in your system, you're shining a big flashlight into what used to be a really dark room. And sometimes you're horrified at what you find. You're like, whoa, didn't know we had 7 different proxies on the path to just log into the app. What were you surprised once you were able to get access to, once you're able to observe the event bus so much better in the paths that these messages are taking? Were you horrified, shocked, surprised at what you found, or did it match what you knew as an operator who had been manually doing this? Did you already have a good enough sense of what was going on in the manual way, or were you even more enhanced with this kind of native observability?
So I like to think of myself as a massive genius on these things, but no, like all this stuff is like more often than not. And whoever, by the way, whoever says it, like, no, then there's no surprises in here. It's a total lie. There's totally surprises all over the place.
Yeah.
So this, like, besides, of course, like obvious things like, just even APM or just distributed traces alone or whatever, that by itself is going to give you something. But like in an evented world, you are basically, the moment that you have observability around this stuff, you are like answering your hypothesis, right? Like, for instance, like one request might actually mean 15 services are supposed to do something, right? Behind the scenes, let's say.
Oof, yeah.
Without that, if something is slow, you just have an assumption that like, well, maybe it's Kafka, maybe it's Rabbit, maybe it's this service, maybe it's this other service. And then it turns out like, oh, there's like a database lock, like that's happening somewhere, like on the third service, and another service is waiting to emit an event and it can't, like it's something absolutely ridiculous. And more, and in most cases, it is something that is, it doesn't even have to be massive. It could be just a simple little thing that like, oh, this is where it adds 4 seconds to the total request time, like something. And
then you scale that out, you think about how many requests are running through, like that adds up quick.
Yeah, totally. And like I remember also like at New Relic there was like this awesome thing. What was it called? It was like, oh yeah, it was an Apdex, right? Like the Apdex of being able to tell like, and so for those who like, is Apdex, by the way, an industry standard now? Is it?
Yeah. From what I had seen, some other, like an org outside of New Relic was like, Apdex is a thing. So it is statistically relevant. We had a lot of good stats folks there.
Yeah, so Apdex, and correct me if I'm wrong. It was basically, it was like, I think it went up to 1, right? Like that's what it was. It was like
a
float that went up to 1.
It was a composite number, right, to represent user satisfaction with the whatever they were trying to do.
Yeah. And so why I'm talking about that is because with a good observability story, you can really dig into that and not do the typical thing, which is like, well, 97% of all users are happy, so who cares? Like now you're able to dig into it and be like, cool, well, I'm going to start like, working on like these little tiny percentages. Cool. Let me get that 97% satisfaction to 98%, to 99, and so on. And the more observability you have, absolutely, the more of the stuff you can dig into, right? So anyway.
Absolutely. And we've got
thought leadering.
that is the job, opinions as a service. So we got a couple last questions to wrap us up. And something we've both talked about is the value and like training that we got at working for New Relic, working for a monitoring company, thinking day in, day out, not only how to monitor, how to sell it, what makes it scalable. How can the average engineer who doesn't want to go work for a monitoring company, but wants to level up their knowledge and are totally confused when they Google observability and get a million different answers, how do you recommend folks start to forge an understanding in this world, starting from nothing. Or maybe,
Yeah.
let's be realistic, starting from, I understand I've got metrics and I know logs, but people tell me observability is something else. How do we help those folks?
Yeah. So what you just said is totally right. Is like I think it goes in multiple levels, right? Like I would personally, I would rather have like to start with, I just assume that I have logs and metrics. And only then I would say, cool, now let's go to like actual APM. Now let's go to traces and yada yada. And it just keeps going. So like for somebody who hasn't started with not like with anything at all, even if let's say if you don't have logs or metrics, well then you start with logs because
Structured
that's the
logs,
most
please structure
basic.
them.
Yeah, just use structured logs and move on. And that's already by itself, that is observability.
Yep.
It is
Yeah.
kind of basic, yes,
Yeah.
but it's like it's totally a building block, right? Like for all this stuff. So without having to SSH into a box or like kexec into something, right?
Yeah. Okay. So from
So
zero to observability, figure out your logs,
logs.
figure out your bare bones.
Totally. And
For
then at that point, yeah, and then at that point, like you say, okay, now that the bare bones stuff is in place, and you go, okay, now I'm going to start caring about metrics some, right? And then let's say what I would imagine is that like before even the days of Grafana and all these other wonderful things, you would just have metrics. Let's say like stats D.
okay,
What's
yeah,
up?
I'm like, how did you chart stuff back in the day?
Stats D with graphite. What's up?
Yeah. Stats D
Anyways,
was Etsy, right? I'll love you, Etsy.
yeah. Yeah, stats D's. I still use stats D all the time. Like just for like a small personal project or whatever. I'll be like, let's just throw this together.
Go
Whatever.
with
Like
what you
just
know. All right.
yeah. So having metrics, right? Like so whether it's Prometheus, some sort of an exporter which gives you metrics, and then another level to that is that like cool. Now I actually want to graph this stuff and be able to display this sort of a thing. So now you would have like some sort of time series data based off of those metrics. So that's like level 3 or 2.5
Who
or
are
something
those
like where you're
charts
like.
for? By
Say
the
that
way,
again?
who are those charts for? Are those charts for humans? Are those charts for computers? Should we be having chart titles that are just the horrible long metric name?
Yeah, you got it. Totally. Yeah, it's it should be a horrible metric name that is not really decipherable for
Bit of
anything.
a leading question, but I open too many dashboards that I'm just like,
Oh my
cool.
God.
I would love to know the customer impact of this graph going wonky, and I can't.
No, that's the whole point, is that like all of this stuff, it like the goal of this is to provide insight to the engineer. That's it. Like that's the entire reason. I just want to gain insights into something. And what the best case scenario is that you gain insights that you didn't even know that you wanted. That would be the awesome part,
Yeah.
where you're just like, where, yeah, you're troubleshooting something and you just get like, huh, that's weird. And that's where like, yeah, dashboarding and just generally drawing time series comes in the first place. And that's where like Grafana and yada yada and yada, you could do all kinds of stuff, whatever matters. And I think like based on those building blocks, then like the fourth and fifth and so on is where you go into tracing and that sort of stuff. And you basically pick that up. But it doesn't make much sense to not have a thorough understanding of metrics, because all this stuff really just builds on previous knowledge that like, well, of course, duh, because like even a log is a metric by itself, right? That like, what is your log output, volume or whatever, or like your rates and so on. Those are metrics as well. So you
can
need
get
to
metrics off traces. I mean, yeah,
yes, exactly.
they're not distinct. There's so much more overlap than people think between these concepts of the different telemetry types.
Absolutely, totally. Yeah, so I think it's just you build on it. You build on all of it, because that's the thing. Like, unlike with a bunch of other tech, like, well, nobody's saying to build anything on Mesos anymore. But this is the one case where no, you still need to build on stuff like those existing things, like logs. They are not going anywhere. Maybe they're stored better, like and maybe you have better UX around like being able to access them. But overall, still, what you said, an FMT print line or like some sort of a printf statement. That's basically the gist. That's what you do, like with maybe prettier colors and structuring around it or whatever. But that's basically it.
Please,
so,
yeah.
So
okay, so it's an evolution. So folks
totally.
looking to brush up should figure out where their knowledge is, kind of in the evolution of observability, where they're most comfortable, and then look at the next step. Don't go looking 2 steps, 5, 10 steps ahead. Go to the next one and kind of continue to evolve.
That's totally it. Like I think like just jumping from nothing to distributed tracing, you probably are going to be slightly confused, especially with the fact that there's like what was there? Open tracing, open telemetry, then it became open telemetry.
Yeah, open tracing,
Then
open census, open
oh yeah,
telemetry.
yeah.
They
Oh, I
married
forgot
and
about open census. Yeah, and like Jaeger,
yeah.
Zipkin,
Yep.
all
Oh
this
yeah.
stuff, and it's
Don't
probably
focus on the
quite a
tech,
lot
focus on the
easier.
concepts.
Yeah, that's totally it. And that's the thing is like, and with many other different areas of the industry where you can probably just forget about what we did 5 years ago. That's the one place where no, you probably don't need, you shouldn't forget, like, because it
Yeah.
totally built on it
It's durable.
on
I made a
itself.
whole career out of, like, we used to talk about the T-shaped engineer, know a lot, and that know a little about a lot, and a lot about a little.
Yeah.
And I'm an I-shaped engineer. I just went monitoring and observability all the way down. And guess what? People hired me for it because it is very durable knowledge that you can take with you, regardless
Totally.
of, if I walk into a Prometheus instance or I walk into some enterprise monitoring tool.
Yeah, completely agree with you. This
Yeah.
wasn't PagerDuty, actually. This was my wife now.
Okay,
Hold
we've
on.
got
All right,
one
I'm
last
good.
question. Do you want to take this though?
No,
You can
no.
take
That was a text message. It's fine, and it's probably about my lunch,
All
probably.
right,
So
we'll cut this out. Our final question we'd like to wrap up with, because we've covered a lot of ground of the evolution of observability from the start of your career, from the start of my career. When we look at 2023, what, in terms of tech trends, what do you think 2023 is the year of? Year of fill in the blank.
Oh boy. Well, I do have opinions about this. Oh, yes, I do. And they're pretty intense, I
Lay it on
think.
us. We're ready.
I think meshes are going to go away. Like, I think that it's not going to be like all of a sudden they just get thrown out. That's
Yeah,
not going to be the case.
do you know how long it takes to deprecate software? I know you know how long.
Well,
We'll
yeah,
be
it's
stuck
just
with meshes
tomorrow.
for a
Just you
while.
just say like no more, and you go to Trader Joe's and return your box.
Yeah.
Like, and you say, I don't want this.
Here's my mesh
Yeah.
box.
So yeah, it's just going to be a slow thing because and the reason why I say that in the first place, it's totally because of the proliferation of asynchronous systems, because folks are starting to see that in order to say, okay, I want to go to the next level of performance, you have to start going away from the systems. And
Yeah.
if that's the case, you no longer will have service A talking to service B. So all that stuff, like what the meshes actually provide, which is, well, there's service discovery, there's transport security, and so on. Well, you don't really, you don't really need any of that stuff anymore, because you don't care about other services. You don't care about your transport. You're just talking to a bus, and that's all there is. And the thing that you gain out of mesh is ultimately, well, at that point, you practically actually don't gain a whole lot of anything. You're just gaining a whole lot of complexity, which is like in the form of a sidecar that you have to manage to some degree, and it's annoying to exec into a container or into a pod at that point, because you have to specify like the second pod. That kind of sucks.
It's a silly thing, but it does matter. It matters when your mental map and your muscle memory is just for the first command.
I know. And like sometimes like the sidecar is the first thing that comes up, so it tries to exec into that. It's just like
Yeah.
Anyway, whatever.
All right. So 2023 is the year that mesh adoption goes to zero.
Not to zero. It
declines.
starts a slow decline, and then ultimately I think it's going to go away. But it's in the same, like in that same vein. It's also like we're talking about circuit breakers, like historic style circuit breakers. I think are totally. I think they're probably already on decline. I don't think there's a Gartner chart that shows you like, hey, look, this concept in computing is starting to die off. But I totally think that it's in that same idea, right? It has the same concept there as well. That it's just going to be less necessary. So
yeah, I love it. All right. And would you like to share a little bit about your world at Streamdal? Where can folks, if they want to learn more about this world of events and they're ready to go to this async world, what do you got for them?
Yeah, so I started a company specifically around this sort of a thing, which is it's an observability company and focusing on streaming data performance monitoring. So it's kind of like, well, actually, no, it's a straight up equivalent of APM, but just for the streaming world, which is essentially providing observability into things where, like, into services and into your systems in general, where multiple systems are talking to each other, but via some sort of buses or whatever else. So we just finished building this now, roughly.
That's lovely.
And we've got few customers already on this thing, and
Looking for more, right?
Yeah. No, no, just hanging out. I just did this for myself. Like,
Just really
no,
passionate about this
I
observability
am
thing.
really passionate, even though I'm like totally like soapboxing about this sort of a thing. But no, like this has been totally a passion project. Like this is the first time ever. Like we started doing this thing like right when COVID hit, and I was like,
Oh,
is this a
whoa.
good idea to like, I don't know, quit your job and I don't know, potentially have no money to
That
work
health
on a startup?
insurance, don't need
Yeah,
that in a
whatever. I don't need
pandemic.
that really. So I totally, it made sense. And this
Yeah.
has been really, really interesting to work on this sort of a thing. So in other words, what you said is totally right. This is not meant for the average, average engineering team. This is really geared for those who are at that, trying to reach that next level of observability. You should definitely have metrics in place. You should probably have distributed tracing in place. You should have
Yes,
all
please.
those things already in place. And then you say, okay, now I want to observe something a little bit more and gain insights into this sort of a thing. And yeah, for that, you could just check it out.
Streamdal.com.
That's right.
We'll have it in the show notes. Thank you so much, Dan, the king of Kafka, the prince of Streamdal, whatever
Sure.
you go by. Do you want to let us know where folks can find you online? Do you tweet? Are you on Mastodon? Do you not do any socials?
I do not do the socials really,
Okay.
but
Streamdal.com then.
you may have heard of this concept of email. I love that thing. It's really popular.
Electronic mail. That's not going to take off.
This electronic mail. I am on LinkedIn. I'm pretty sure I'm on there.
Right.
There's Dan Selans on there.
All right. Many ways to
that's
connect and find you and your lovely company. Thank you so much for taking the time today. And we hope everyone has got a quiet pager rotation and all the observability they need for their systems. Thanks.
Thank you.